Good morning. I'm Joanne Britton, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to our third of our Fall Variety Pack. Today before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind you to turn off your cell phones and turn on your tea coil if that applies to you. This morning we are very happy to welcome Caleb Elfenbein to our class. He is Associate Professor in History and Religious Studies at Grinnell College, and he's going to talk to us today on the subject of the U.S. in the Middle East. Wow. Caleb.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We've had some technical issues up here, but I think we're all set. All right. Got the glasses back on, the microphone going. So complicated up here. Well, good morning. Thank you all so much for coming out. As Joanne said, my name is Caleb Elfenbein, and Joanne's an old neighbor of mine, so it's really nice to see her this morning. And this is my second time doing a session with you all. And I look back in my notes, and I think it was just about 3 years ago, 3 years and maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago that I was here talking about a very different subject back a few years ago. Is George here yet? There's George. So when George Drake approached me about joining you today, he mentioned that there would be interest in doing something around the Middle East. And George, you should know that these open-ended assignments are pretty tough. But I tried. I did my best to come up with something that I thought would be of interest today. And as I thought about what I wanted to accomplish with our time together, I began really thinking about what we hope to do, what we hope to learn when we study other parts of the world. Not just what we want to learn, but what do we learn when we study other parts of the world. I want to use this opportunity with you today to spend a little bit of time in the Middle East. But by doing so, I actually want to think about what we learn about the United States by doing that. And looking abroad, we can both learn about other cultures and histories, and a lot about ourselves by what we see, not just what we have heard others say about the history of U.S. involvement in this part of the world. And how did I come to this idea, right? That by spending time together today in the Middle East, we would actually learn quite a bit about the United States. Well, I now teach students out over at the college who have grown up their entire lives with the United States actively involved in military conflict in the Middle East. They do not know a world in which the United States is not at war in the Middle East. Let's let that sink in for a moment. Right? This is a really long time. In fact, right, this is now 27 years. So, as I'm with you for today, right, I want to be thinking a little bit about why this is the case. And there are explanations, of course, that would suggest that this part of the world is somehow more naturally prone to conflict and war. But as an historian, I really need to ask the question, could this level of violence that we're seeing in the Middle East be a natural feature of life in this part of the world across history? I don't know that the Middle East could actually continue existing if this level of violence was something that was constant throughout the history of this region. So I want to think together a little bit about that in and through a consideration of the US in the Middle East. Now, I really like working with maps a lot. And I find this kind of map really fascinating. There are no labels, right? And it's actually, it's really disorienting seeing a map with no labels. I think we're so accustomed to seeing the world organized with lines and labels. Of course, right, what we're looking at here is what now we typically think of as the Middle East. This is not working. Technology is really breaking down for us today. There we go. Thank you. All right. Yes. So here we are with what we typically think of as the Middle East, right? So we have North Africa here, and we have coming over Egypt right here, and Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, present-day Turkey there, Syria, Iraq, Iran, right? The reason that I wanted to create a map to show you like this without labels is to point out that really before the 20th century, people living in this part of the world would not have thought about themselves as living in the Middle East. This designation of this region is actually a pretty recent phenomenon. The way of understanding the Middle East, right, as a coherent region, is really the result of post-Great War, right, post-World War I developments. And as the 20th century wore on, the United States became more and more involved in this part of the world. Now, one of the things that I had done for today was to create a map with a bunch of different layers that I wanted to take you through. Unfortunately, this was one of the problems that we were having with the technology. And I just wanted to take you really quickly through how what I call the political geography of this region changed over the course of the 20th century. And when I say political geography, I mean things like borders, nation states coming into existence that hadn't existed before, right? Real changes in how the political makeup of the region unfolded over time. So what we have here in this first layer of the map, with this shape, this is what the Ottoman Empire looked like at the turn of the 20th century. Right? The Ottoman Empire, which had been around since the 15th century and lasted through the close of the Great War, or World War I. Right? This is what it looked like at the close of, or at the start of the 20th century. So in the mid-19th century, Greece, right here, had broken off from the empire. But the Ottoman Empire still really stretched well up into Europe. Came down, encompassed what is today Turkey, down through Iraq, the western part of Saudi Arabia, over into Egypt, and over into this corner of Libya. Right? This was a pretty big empire, as you can see, and right, this was really a huge part of life in this region of the world, right, the Ottoman Empire. Pretty quickly into the 20th century, the empire began to really shrink in size. This whole part, what we could consider the European part of the Ottoman Empire, by 1911, 1912, was no longer part of the empire. We had a series of revolts wherein Bulgaria declared independence from the empire. Austria, then still right, an empire, annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina here. And Albania also, right, experienced a revolt down here. And this part of Libya, where we now have Tripoli and Benghazi, very much in the news in the last few years, was occupied by Italy. So the empire now, at this point, had shrunk to really this size, so much smaller. With the close of the Great War, we saw something come into existence called the Mandate System. And this was put in place by the victorious powers in World War I. And what we ended up with was an independent Republic of Turkey as a result of a treaty between the victorious powers and the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, so in Turkey. And then a series of what the Covenant of the League of Nations called mandates. And this was a series of territories that were to be governed by European powers, victorious powers. And it's out of this mandate system that we have a lot of the nation states that we now see on a map like this emerge. So out of the mandate system, we have Iraq, which was a British territory, what is now Israel-Palestine, but then called Palestine, which was a British territory, Jordan, which was also a British territory, what's now Syria, right there, which was a French territory, and Lebanon. So the idea in the Covenant of the League of Nations was that these communities were incapable of governing themselves, and that over time, with proper tutelage, they would be able to achieve independence at such a time as the European powers decided that they would be capable of governing themselves independently. So out of this system, Iraq became an independent nation in 1936. Lebanon became an independent nation in 1943. Syria became an independent nation in 1946. And what had been called Israel, or what had been called Palestine, excuse me, became Israel in 1948. Egypt, which had been part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries, was occupied by the British in 1882 and declared a protectorate in 1914 at the start of the Great War. The British gave Egypt partial independence in 1922. It was never formally part of the mandate system, but was under British occupation. And there were remnants of British occupation until 1952 in the revolution, the Free Officers' Revolution in 1952. Iran, over here, never formally a part of the mandate system, but occupied by the British during the Great War, became independent once again in 1921 by treaty with the British. And finally, Saudi Arabia, also never formally part of the mandate system, became an independent country in 1932. So in the space of a half century, you can see the tremendous change in, again, this term of political geography of this region, moving from the Ottoman Empire to a series of independent nation states through the governance of European powers. Okay, so having just given you a very quick rundown of all these incredible changes in the space of 50 or so years, I'd like to return to the idea of what we can learn about the U.S. by exploring a few key moments in the history of U.S. activity in this region. Couldn't go through the entire history, right, of U.S. activity in the region. It's way too much, and so I've selected a few key moments. And I think that by focusing on these few key moments, we can learn a lot about historical developments in the region, but I think that we can also learn a lot about the United States through these moments, right? And again, this is what we can learn about the United States through what we see here, not the way that the US government or media have talked about the United States and the Middle East. Really kind of seeing on the ground what it is the United States has been up to. Okay, so the first moment that I want to spend some time talking about with you is from 1919. So this is just after the end of the Great War, and European powers are really trying to figure out what this region is going to look like. And as the peace conference proceeded and the League of Nations was coming into existence, and the victorious powers were talking about this covenant of the League of Nations, one of the things that they outlined was that there were certain communities that needed, as I mentioned, to be tutored, that weren't capable of governing themselves. And they were, of course, then in charge of figuring out who fell into this category. Well, as you can see in this picture, in June and July of 1919, something called the Syrian National Congress came together and met. So representatives from the area that became an independent Syria. But really, right, these would be folks from what we now call Lebanon, down into Palestine, and present-day Syria. And they were talking about what it is they wanted after the Great War. And this was, in theory, part of the process. In the Covenant of the League of Nations, there is provision for communities themselves being part of this process. They rejected, right, these delegates rejected the idea of being grouped into the communities that needed tutelage. They wanted to be independent. And they released a series of statements collected into a book talking about the independence of Syria. In this resolution that's at the heart of this book, they declared, in the event of the rejection by the peace conference of this just protest, that is, we want to be independent, we, relying on the declarations of President Woodrow Wilson, that his object in waging war was to put an end to the ambition of conquest and colonization, can only regard the mandate mentioned in the Covenant of the League of Nations as equivalent to the rendering of economical and technical assistance that does not prejudice our complete independence. And desiring that our country not fall a prey to colonization, and believing that the United States is farthest away from any thought of colonization and has no political ambition in our country, we will seek the assistance of America. Right, so this is in the context of people in this region having a real understanding that European powers had their sights set on territory in this part of the world. We know from history that the victorious powers of the Great War rejected this demand, naming France as the mandatory power in this region. Despite having played a pretty large role in creating the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson stood on the sidelines as all of this was happening because Congress never ratified the League of Nations charter and opted to not become part of the new international organization. Right? And what's interesting is that delegates to the Syrian National Congress understood the United States to not really have any skin in the game at this point. Right? And as a result, they thought that the United States could act as a neutral source of assistance in the early days of what the National Congress, Syrian National Congress, imagined to be, right, a new democratic state. But again, the United States never ratified the League of Nations Charter and opted to largely remain aloof from the post-war order in what became known as the Middle East. Still at this point, often referred to as the Near East, a designation that was reflecting the way that the British thought about the world within the context of their empire, the Far East being China, Japan, and the Near East being Turkey and what became the Middle East. Right, so this is a really interesting moment, and one really important, I think, to begin our exploration. Right, to think that in the end of the first quarter of the 20th century, there were communities in the region that really thought about the United States as potentially a neutral arbiter in this situation. Okay, so that's moment one. Moment two, this really famous picture. How many people have seen this picture before? A few people. This is a really famous meeting. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in February of 1945, Valentine's Day as a matter of fact, in 1945, met with Ibn Saud, or King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia, on the USS Quincy. And they met in the Suez Canal in Egypt. Right, this is a really important meeting in the history of U.S. engagement in the region. Shortly after this meeting between these two figures, right? So this is 13 years after he successfully, King Abdulaziz successfully brought together a series of independent areas in Saudi Arabia into one political entity, Saudi Arabia. After this meeting, construction began on the first U.S. airbase in Saudi Arabia, called Zara. And importantly, right, this began a military relationship that continues through today. Right? So this is the first moment of a relationship that I think we have been hearing a lot about in recent decades. Importantly, this airbase that was agreed to during this meeting was built right near a town housing the Saudi American joint company that became known as Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company. This has in fact become what's thought to be the largest corporation in the world. It oversees oil production in Saudi Arabia. Coincidentally, right, so this company, which first began in the 1930s with the discovery of oil reserves in Saudi Arabia, right, was very much bound up in this military relationship. So we have the discovery of oil, the construction of an airbase right near the town that housed this company. And just after this meeting, we see a dramatic increase in oil production in the late 1940s and 1950s with the construction of a series of pipelines in Saudi Arabia. Okay, so this is moment two that I wanted us to think about in this region. And there will be time for questions afterwards, so if you have questions about any of this, please note them, and we'll come back to these moments. The third moment that I'd like to talk a little bit about is recognition of the State of Israel in 1948. And this is a copy of the memo that Harry Truman wrote to recognize the new State of Israel on May 14th in 1948. During the British Mandate in Palestine, right, so following the Great War up until this moment, something called the Jewish Agency became an increasingly part of British governance. So the British government really was involved in governance of this mandate territory, but the Jewish Agency were really the people on the ground who were doing a lot of the administration. Once the British government, that is, announced in February of 1947 that it intended to terminate the mandate, the United Nations, right, the second attempt at an international organization, began working to find a solution to what had become a really complex situation. That is, following especially 1917, there had been really significant emigration from Europe to Palestine of Jewish communities. And the British were constantly trying to negotiate the tensions between newly arriving communities and people already living in this territory. Some Jewish, some Christian, many Muslim. Right? So the United Nations was really trying to figure out how to deal with this situation as it became very clear that the British were going to terminate the mandate. So what was going to happen at this moment? The United Nations suggested and approved a plan to partition Palestine into 3 separate entities: a Jewish state, an Arab state, and an international zone around Jerusalem. This solution was opposed by most parties involved. The UN tried to create a trusteeship over Palestine, that is, to actually administer the territory itself, but this effort also ended in failure. After David Ben-Gurion became Israel's first prime minister, read aloud a declaration of independence on May 14th, the White House issued a statement recognizing the new state of Israel. Of course, a war ensued between Israel and its neighbors, also newly independent, right? Many of its neighbors, Jordan, Syrian. And as a result of this war, we saw mass displacement, creation of a really significant refugee problem, which continues to haunt the region in the surrounding countries. Israelis tend to think of this war in 1948 as a war for independence, while for many Palestinians and Arabs, this is called a Nakba, or the catastrophe. And of course, there have been multiple conflicts between Israel and its neighbors in the decades since, including in 1956 in a conflict over shipping in the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, 1967, also called the Six-Day War, in 1973, or the Yom Kippur or October War. The United States continues to play a contested role in the Arab-Israeli conflict. It positions itself, or attempts to, as a neutral arbiter. But this claim really arouses the ire of Palestinian and Arab communities, in part because of what they understand to be generally unwavering support of Israel. Since 1949, the United States has given at least $130 billion to Israel. First in the form largely of economic assistance, and then increasingly in the form of military assistance. So, right, this is not at all, on my part, a comment on Israel. I have my own thoughts about the matter, and I'd be happy to share them with you. My point here is to show that there is a self-perception of being a neutral arbiter in this situation. But when we see, right, starting with this recognition and then the relationship that unfolded, we can perhaps see how other communities in the region might not understand the United States to play that role, right? And by thinking about U.S. actions, we can learn a lot about not what the U.S. says about its participation, but what happens on the ground, what happens in reality. And I think, again, this is an important opportunity for us to reflect on what we're trying to achieve in our activity abroad. The next moment that I'd like to talk through with you for a few minutes is something called Operation Ajax. How many people have heard of this? Operation Ajax. Okay, a few people. After the Great War, and with British support, a military officer named Reza Khan became the Shah of Iran. His installation in power actually weakened existing democratic institutions that were created by one of the earliest constitutions in the region, having come into effect in Persia in 1906. Reza Khan remained in power as an ally of the British for some decades, and the British had significant interests in Persian oil, dating back to the early 20th century. In fact, the Darcy oil concession is the first such agreement between a European power and a community in the Middle East around oil. That was in 1901. In 1941, the British forced Reza Khan out of power because he had begun talking about his sympathies with the Nazi regime in Germany. And they replaced him with his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, in exchange for some democratic reforms that included a newly empowered parliament. Well, this parliament elected someone named Mohammad Mossadegh in 1951. He was very popular. He campaigned on a platform of nationalizing industry in Iran. That included the oil industry. Very quickly, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, worked to undermine Mossadegh, and these activities really began to alienate people around Iran. Right? Mossadegh was, again, quite popular. In fact, this aroused so much ire that the Shah had to flee Iran. In the ensuing crisis, Mossadegh dissolved parliament and in turn undermined his own support, creating a really significant crisis. Shortly thereafter, the United States and the British worked with elements of the Iranian military to lead a coup and to reinstall Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as Shah. This is called Operation Ajax. Right, so a democratically elected leader is deposed via military coup and a Shah reinstalled by the United States and the British. In the decades that followed, the Shah became increasingly autocratic, arresting, imprisoning, and torturing thousands of political opponents, many of them charged with being communists, right? This is in the context of the Cold War. A long-time and close anti-communist ally of Washington, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's reign created the conditions for the Iranian Revolution. The United States government then supported Iran's opponent in the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, helping to solidify one Saddam Hussein's grip on power in Iraq. Moment 5, Camp David Accords. Here we have Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, US President Jimmy Carter, and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. This is September 1978. Following the 1973 war between Israel and its neighbors, the United States embarked on a pretty significant push to try and find a solution to this ongoing conflict. The Camp David Accords was the first instance in which the Land for Peace formula, now quite well known, that was established by Security Council Resolution 242 back in 1967, was put into effect. This formula, Land for Peace, then became the foundation for the 1993 Oslo Accords, which in turn laid the foundation for a Palestinian state. Following Camp David, in which the Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egyptian control, having been occupied by Israel in 1967, the United States began increasing its military and economic assistance to Egypt. And in fact, since that period, the United States has provided more aid to Egypt than to any other country save Israel. Not so incidentally, this military assistance has allowed the Egyptian military to maintain an incredibly strong grip on power, opening the US to a lot of criticism from Egyptian democratic activists over the years. This occurred especially under Hosni Mubarak, who succeeded Anwar Sadat after his assassination. That resulted actually from his having signed the Camp David Accords. Moment 6, wars in Iraq. 1990 to the present. 1990 to the present. I was just coming of age, actually, when this was happening in 1990. I was 14 years old. And I remember these scenes of really being amazed watching CNN with the night vision capabilities of the cameras in Iraq, and actually seeing the bombardment of Baghdad, remembering that, right? And this was in Basra. I remember Baghdad myself. This was the beginning of a conflict that resulted from Saddam Hussein's invasion and occupation of Kuwait, which he claimed was rightfully part of Iraq. Quite famously, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq at the time, April Gillespie, had told Saddam Hussein that the United States did not take positions on Arab disputes, but that the matter should be handled peacefully. This, I think, for Saddam Hussein was all but saying that you are free to do as you please, which was largely, I think, not a correct interpretation of Gillespie's words, but nonetheless precipitated an invasion and occupation. By November of that year, the United States was increasingly concerned about threats to Saudi Arabia and began working with the United Nations to build a coalition. And Operation Desert Storm, right, this campaign, began in January of 1991 and continued for a month before Operation Desert Saber, that was the ground assault, began. By late February of that year, operations had successfully pushed the Iraqi military out of Kuwait, and President George Bush declared a ceasefire. During the conflict, President Bush encouraged Iraqis opposed to Hussein, especially Shiites in the south of the country and Kurds in the north, to revolt. There was no real support forthcoming from the United States, and his military, Saddam Hussein's military, was still functioning, and he was able to pretty brutally suppress these revolts quite quickly. This in turn led to a series of no-fly zones in the north and south of the country, which remained in place into the 21st century. These no-fly zones were occasioned periodic military engagement between Iraq and coalition forces. During the 1990s, the United States and Iraq continued to wrangle over access for weapons inspectors in Iraq. These were part of the terms of the ceasefire at the end of the formal war. Right? Saddam Hussein had famously used weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, against people within Iraq, and the United States insisted that weapons inspectors be allowed to enter Iraq. And this really continued, these debates about weapons inspections continued throughout the 90s and into 2000. In 2002, the United States sponsored a UN resolution calling for renewed weapons inspections. Iraq complied, at least that's what the UN inspectors found, though the United States and the United Kingdom disputed these findings. This, quite famously, right, is Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, speaking before the United Nations, making the case for Iraq having flouted UN authority. This became the basis for the U.S. invasion, right? Again, not working through the UN, but the U.S. invasion, along largely with the British, for the Second Gulf War in March of 2003. This was based in part on faulty intelligence of Saddam Hussein's involvement in September 11th, and intelligence claiming that Iraq still possessed weapons of mass destruction. This really famous picture of a statue in Baghdad of Saddam Hussein falling, following the U.S. Occupation, quite famously the claim, right, that mission had been accomplished, is really quite tragic, because the planning for the aftermath of this war was pretty much non-existent. And this image is taken from a really famous press conference early on after the war, when Secretary of Defense Donald Roosevelt claimed that things happen, things are messy in democracies. Under his orders, the entire Iraqi military was disbanded, and anyone with affiliation to the Ba'ath Party, that is pretty much anyone who had ever worked in government, was banned from working in the government from that moment forward, which essentially left no one to actually staff the government. Right? So there was no military and no effective government in Iraq for quite some time after the invasion and occupation. That sets the context for the rise of what we know of as the Islamic State, or Daesh. Many of its leaders had served in the Iraqi military that the United States disbanded, and many of them had spent time in US-run prisons after the war. Moreover, since 2003, this is not to mention from 1990 through 2003, since 2003, at least 150,000 Iraqi civilians have died from the violence, post-war violence. Some estimates, which expand the count to those who have lost their lives as a result of the after effects of the war, so a failing infrastructure, a lack of a public health system. If we include all of those deaths, then the numbers reach upwards of 500,000 people. And I think that we could rightfully argue that though the United States does not bear direct blame for that, we can really learn a lot about what has guided US actions by thinking about these deaths and their effect. And I think it's fair to say that people in Iraq have a pretty different understanding than a lot of people in the United States about US involvement in the country over the last 26 years. And I think it's fair to ask how this will play out in the years to come. So very quickly, I just want to return to the beginning of my comments. And I'd like to close by asking what we learn about ourselves from spending some time in the Middle East. What can we see by looking at the last 100 years of US activity in the Middle East? Of course, there are many, many other moments I could have focused on, some much more positive than those I've included. However, I have included these moments because I understand that they have had a profound effect on the region. And I'm left wondering what they say about us. Do they reflect the values that we want others to see in us? I hope you do not see my comments today as being driven by a political agenda. I'm a historian, and I really strive to tell the story that I see in the data, in the information that I see. I will admit, however, that the premise of my talk, that we really should use the study of other parts of the world to reflect on our own place in this world, whether as individuals or as a country, is driven by what I understand to be an ethical agenda. Thank you very much for your time today. I look forward to questions and answers. Thank you.
Yeah.